On the morning of April 27, 2011, the town of Bridgeport, Alabama woke to an uneasy stillness. The air was thick and warm, heavy with moisture that clung to skin like a damp cloth. People stepped outside their front doors and felt the weight of the sky pressing down. In the kitchen of a small white house on Willow Street, Mary Ann Thompson poured coffee for her husband, Gary, and watched him stare out the window. The wind was not blowing. It was a windless, breathless morning, the kind that old-timers called a tornado day, the kind where everything waits. Gary Thompson had lived in Bridgeport his whole life, 57 years. He knew the signs. He remembered the Easter Sunday outbreak in 1974 when he was just a boy when a tornado touched down just outside Stevenson and tore the roof off the feed store. He had been in the basement of his uncle's house then, listening to the roar. That sound never leaves you. He set down his coffee cup and said to Mary Ann, "I do not like the feel of this day." Mary Ann nodded. She was a schoolteacher at Bridgeport Elementary, and the children had been restless all week. The weather broadcasts were full of warnings. Every evening, the local news meteorologist, a man named Mark, would stand in front of his radar maps and point at the red and orange blotches sweeping up from the Gulf. This could be the big one, he told viewers, and they listened. But it is one thing to hear about a storm on television and another to feel it in your bones. By 10 o'clock, the National Weather Service in Huntsville had already issued a tornado watch for most of northern Alabama. Gary tuned his radio to the weather band and heard the steady drone of static between the alerts. He went to his basement and checked the supplies: flashlights, batteries, bottled water, blankets, the first aid kit. He pulled the heavy wooden door open and flipped on the light. The basement was damp and smelled of concrete and old laundry, but it was safe. He had reinforced the walls himself after the 1974 storm. He had added a steel beam above the stairs. He was ready. But not everyone in Bridgeport was ready. The town was small, just over 3,000 people, nestled in the Appalachian foothills near the Tennessee line. It had a main street with a hardware store, a diner, a post office, and a red brick bank. People knew each other by first name. Neighbor helped neighbor. On a normal Wednesday, the biggest excitement might be a fender bender at the intersection of Highway 72 and County Road 9. But this Wednesday was not normal. At the Bridgeport Diner, a few regulars sat at the counter drinking coffee and watching the television mounted on the wall. The weather radar showed a line of storms stretching from Mississippi to Tennessee, pulsing with bright red and purple cells. One cell in particular, near the town of Hackleburg, seemed to be intensifying rapidly. The meteorologist on the screen said the words "warning" and "dangerous" and "take cover." A man named Bobby Reynolds, who drove a truck for the county road department, put down his fork and said, "That storm is headed straight for us." The diner went quiet. Then the owner, a gray-haired woman named Louise, said, "Well, we better get the basement ready." She had a basement under the diner where they stored canned goods and old chairs. She told everyone to finish their breakfast and then head home or to shelter. No one argued. By 11:30, the sky had turned a sickly green. The light was wrong. It was a color that did not exist in nature except before a severe storm. The trees began to sway, first slowly, then with more urgency. The wind picked up. The air pressure dropped and ears popped. At Bridgeport Elementary, the principal ordered all students to move into the interior hallways. Mary Ann Thompson was with her third graders. She had them sit against the walls, knees to their chests, heads down, hands over their heads. They practiced what they had drilled. The children were scared, but they were quiet. One little boy named Jimmy kept asking, "Is the monster coming, Mrs. Thompson?" Mary Ann told him, "We are ready, we are brave." Outside the school, the wind began to whistle. Leaves and dust and bits of trash flew through the air. The lights flickered and went out. The emergency generator kicked on, but it only ran the hallway lights. The classrooms went dim. Mary Ann felt her heart pounding. She held little Jimmy's hand and whispered a prayer. Meanwhile, Gary Thompson was on his front porch watching the sky. He saw something he had never seen before. A low, rolling cloud approached from the southwest, and at its base a horizontal tube of mist was rotating. The cloud was churning, lifting, and falling as if it were breathing. Gary knew what that was. It was the first sign of a tornado forming. He ran inside and yelled, "Mary Ann is not here, she is at the school." He grabbed his phone and called her. The call dropped. The towers were already overwhelmed. He tried again, nothing. He ran to his truck and started the engine, but then he looked back at the sky and knew he would never make it the 2 miles to the school. The tornado was already on the ground. In the Bridgeport Diner, Louise herded her customers down the narrow stairs into the basement. They could hear the wind screaming outside. The windows of the diner rattled and then burst. Glass shattered across the floor. The lights went out, someone screamed. The roar grew louder, a deep thrumming sound that vibrated through the concrete. It was like standing next to a freight train, but deeper, heavier. It was a sound that seemed to come from inside your own chest. Everyone in the basement covered their ears. The tornado that struck Bridgeport on April 27, 2011, was one of the strongest ever recorded in the United States. It was an EF5 on the enhanced Fujita scale, with winds estimated at over 200 miles per hour. It was nearly a mile wide at its peak. It had already devastated the town of Hackleburg, 60 miles to the west, killing dozens of people and leveling entire neighborhoods. Now it was bearing down on Bridgeport with undiminished fury. Gary Thompson stood in his living room watching the wall of dark cloud approach. The rain began falling horizontally. Hail started to pound the roof, chunks of ice the size of golf balls, then baseballs. The noise was deafening. Gary knew he had seconds. He ran to the basement door, pulled it open, and descended the stairs just as the tornado ripped the roof off his house. The pressure change made his ears pop painfully. The basement door blew open above him, and he could see the sky through the gap, a swirling vortex of gray and black. Debris flew past the opening, pieces of lumber, a child's tricycle, a car tire. Gary pulled the door shut and wedged a chair against it. He huddled in the corner and prayed. At the school, Mary Ann Thompson heard the sound change. The wind went from a whistle to a roar. The hallway walls began to shudder, the ceiling tiles fell, the children screamed. Mary Ann covered little Jimmy with her own body. She felt the building shudder violently, and then the world was full of noise. The roof peeled back, the walls gave way. The hallway became an open corridor to the sky. The wind lifted desks and books and backpacks into the air. Mary Ann held on to Jimmy and prayed with all her being. And then, as suddenly as it came, the wind died. The roar receded, the sky lightened. It was not silence because there was still the sound of rain and wind, but the terrible deep voice of the tornado was gone. Mary Ann lifted her head. She was covered in dust and splinters. Jimmy was crying but alive. Around them the school was a ruin. The roof was gone, the walls were collapsed in places. The hallway was exposed to the gray afternoon light. Children were crying, teachers were calling out names. Mary Ann got to her feet, her legs shaking, and began to help. Above ground, the town of Bridgeport was unrecognizable. The diner was gone. The hardware store was a pile of bricks. Red brick bank had caved in. Trees were stripped of bark and snapped in half. Cars were tossed into fields. Houses were reduced to slabs. The tornado had ripped a path a mile wide and several miles long through the heart of the town. Gary Thompson climbed out of his basement and stood in the ruins of his house. The walls were gone. The roof was gone. Only the basement remained intact. He looked toward the school and saw nothing but wreckage. He started walking. He stepped over twisted metal and broken glass. He passed a neighbor who was sitting on the ground, bleeding, staring at nothing. He kept walking. He had to find Mary Ann. He found her at the school, standing in the parking lot, holding little Jimmy in her arms. Her face was cut. Her clothes were torn, but she was standing. Gary ran to her. They held each other, not saying anything. Around them, sirens were wailing. People were running, searching for loved ones. The air smelled of gasoline and wet wood and something else, the acrid smell of destruction. The Bridgeport tornado of April 27, 2011, would eventually be remembered as one of the deadliest in Alabama history. It killed 11 people in the Bridgeport area alone. It destroyed over 200 homes. It left a scar on the land and on the hearts of the people who lived there. But in the immediate aftermath, in the hour after the storm passed, there was no time to count the dead. There was only time to help the living, and that is what the people of Bridgeport did. Neighbors pulled neighbors from the rubble. Strangers tended to wounds. Firefighters and police officers from surrounding towns arrived within minutes. The rescue effort began before the last cloud had cleared. It began in the rain and the mud and the chaos. And it would continue for days, weeks, years. The healing would take a long time, but the spirit of Bridgeport, that quiet, stubborn, small-town spirit, would not be broken. They had survived the worst, and they would rebuild. That night, the town of Bridgeport felt like a wound that would not stop bleeding. The sun set behind a layer of dust and smoke, and the only light came from headlights and flashlights and the occasional distant bolt of lightning from storms still rumbling to the east. Mary Ann Thompson did not sleep. She sat on the curb outside what was left of the school, holding Jimmy in her lap. The boy had finally stopped crying. His mother had been found alive, pulled from the rubble of their home 2 blocks away, but she was on her way to the hospital in Chattanooga with a broken arm and a concussion. Jimmy did not know that yet. Mary Ann told him his mommy was going to be okay. She hoped it was true. Gary had found a case of bottled water in the back of a shattered pickup truck. He walked through the parking lot, handing out bottles to anyone who needed one. His hands were cut from pulling boards and nails out of piles of debris. He did not feel the pain. He saw a woman sitting on the ground, holding a photograph of a man in uniform. She was whispering his name. Gary knelt beside her and offered water. She did not take it. She just kept staring at the photograph. He touched her shoulder and moved on. The bridge over the Tennessee River had been damaged, but it was still passable. National Guard trucks rolled into town just after midnight. Soldiers in camouflage jumped out and began setting up a field command post in the parking lot of the collapsed grocery store. They had generators and floodlights and medical supplies. Within an hour, a makeshift triage center was operating under a blue tarp stretched between 2 Humvees. Doctors and nurses from nearby towns had arrived on their own, driving through debris and down power lines. They worked by flashlight, stitching wounds and setting broken bones. There was no anesthetic, no time for waiting. A boy named Tommy, age 9, had a piece of glass embedded in his cheek. A volunteer nurse named Carol told him a story about a dragon while she pulled the glass out with tweezers. Tommy did not scream. He bit his lip and bled and held still. By dawn, the full scale of the destruction became visible. The sun rose over a landscape that looked like a giant hand had swept across the land. The diner was a pile of bricks and twisted steel. The hardware store was nothing but a concrete slab with a cash register sitting upright in the middle, its drawer hanging open, the coins inside still gleaming. A child's doll lay in the street, its dress torn, one eye missing. A fire hydrant had been ripped from the ground and thrown through the wall of the post office. The post office itself was a hollow shell. The flagpole was bent at a 45-degree angle, the flag still attached but shredded to ribbons. Gary Thompson walked through the ruins of his neighborhood. His house was gone, but he had expected that. What he did not expect was the silence. There were no birds, no dogs barking, no distant traffic, just the sound of wind moving through broken glass and the occasional crack of a timber settling. He found a photograph of his mother, the frame shattered, the glass gone, but the image of her smiling face untouched. He slipped it into his pocket. He found his father's old pocket watch lying in the mud, still ticking. He wound it and put it in his pocket too. At the elementary school, the search for survivors continued. Rescue teams with dogs combed through the collapsed gymnasium. The roof had fallen in, pinning a janitor named Earl under a steel beam. It took 6 men and a hydraulic jack to lift the beam enough to pull him out. Earl had a broken leg and a punctured lung, but he was alive. They loaded him onto a stretcher and carried him to the triage tent. Earl kept asking about his cat. No one had seen the cat. The town's only fire station had been destroyed. The fire truck was buried under the collapsed bay doors, its sirens silent, its lights shattered. But the volunteer firefighters did not stop. They commandeered pickup trucks and drove through the debris, pulling people out of collapsed houses, carrying them to the triage center. One firefighter, a man named Dale, lost his own house but did not know it yet. He worked for 18 hours straight, never stopping, never asking for a break. Someone handed him a sandwich. He ate it standing up, staring at nothing, then went back to work. The morning brought volunteers from surrounding counties. Cars and trucks lined the highway as far as the eye could see. People came with chainsaws and shovels and coolers full of food. The Red Cross set up a mobile kitchen in the parking lot of the Baptist church, which had somehow survived with only minor damage. The church's steeple was leaning, but the sanctuary was intact. The pastor, a bald man named Reverend Thomas, opened the doors and turned the sanctuary into a shelter. Families slept on pews. Children played in the aisle. A woman gave birth to a baby girl that morning, right there in the church, with a retired nurse named Betty delivering the baby on a pile of donated blankets. They named the baby Grace. By noon, the first news crews arrived. Satellite trucks parked along the highway. Reporters in windbreakers stood in front of the wreckage and spoke into cameras. They asked survivors how they felt. Most survivors just stared at the cameras and said nothing. One old man, a farmer named Luther, looked straight into the lens and said, "We feel like we've been hit by a train, but we ain't dead yet," and he turned and walked away. Mary Ann Thompson found Gary sitting on the curb outside the church. She sat down beside him. They did not talk. They just watched the chaos around them. Trucks drove past. People carried boxes of supplies. A dog wandered through the crowd, lost and scared. Gary reached out and took Mary Ann's hand. She squeezed it. They had been married for 14 years. They had built a life together. Now that life was a pile of splinters, but they were still here. They were still holding hands. That afternoon, a small plane flew overhead, towing a banner that said, "Alabama Strong." People looked up and waved. Some cried, some cheered. The banner flapped in the wind and the plane banked and flew away. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. It meant the outside world knew they existed. It meant they were not forgotten. In the days that followed, the work of rebuilding began in earnest. FEMA arrived with trailers and paperwork. Insurance adjusters set up tables in the church parking lot. People stood in line for hours waiting to file claims, holding plastic bags filled with whatever documents they had saved. Many had nothing. No birth certificates, no deeds, no photographs. Everything had been swept away. But the spirit of Bridgeport was not swept away. It was bruised and battered, but it was stubborn. Neighbors who had never spoken before now shared meals. Families who had lost everything opened their doors to families who had lost even more. A teenage boy named Derek used his own birthday money to buy cases of diapers and baby formula, which he delivered to the church on his bicycle. A retired carpenter named Elias gathered a group of volunteers and began rebuilding a house for a widow named Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had died in the tornado. They worked from dawn to dusk, framing walls, nailing shingles, painting the porch. When they finished, Mrs. Patterson stood on her new porch and wept. She said it looked just like the old one. The tornado had taken lives, but it had not taken the will to live. The funerals began that weekend. 11 people had died in Bridgeport. Their names were read at a memorial service held in the high school football field because the churches were too small. The bleachers were filled. People stood along the sidelines. The governor came and spoke. He said words about courage and resilience. Some people listened, others just stared at the sky as if expecting another storm. Gary and Mary Ann Thompson attended the service. They sat in the front row of the bleachers. Jimmy sat between them, holding a teddy bear that a volunteer had given him. When the names were read, Mary Ann closed her eyes. She knew some of those names: Louise, the diner owner; the janitor, Earl's wife, who had been at home when the tornado hit; a little girl named Sarah, who had been in the 3rd grade, 2 doors down from Mary Ann's classroom. Mary Ann had taught Sarah to read. She had watched her learn to spell her name. Now Sarah was gone. After the service, Gary drove them to the ruins of their house. They stood on the concrete slab that had been their living room. The floor plan was still visible in the outline of the foundation. Here was the kitchen, here was the bedroom, here was the spot where their Christmas tree had stood every year. Gary found a piece of the fireplace hearth, cracked and blackened but still recognizable. He picked it up and held it. Mary Ann found a single earring, a silver hoop she had worn on their wedding day. It was bent, but she put it in her pocket. They decided to rebuild, not right away. They would live with Gary's brother in Huntsville for a few months, but they would come back. This was home. This was where their lives had happened. They could not let a storm take that away. Spring turned to summer, summer turned to fall. The debris was cleared, the roads were repaired. New houses rose from the ashes one by one. They did not look the same as the old ones. They were different shapes, different colors. But they were built with the same hands that had once held hammers and nails before the storm. The town did not look the same, but it looked alive. The Bridgeport Tornado of 2011 became a chapter in the town's history, a story told to children who were too young to remember. It became a scar on the land, but also a badge of honor. People who survived it never forgot. They carried the memory in their bones. They felt the wind differently on stormy days. They watched the sky with a new kind of attention. They knew now that the world could change in an instant, but they also knew that they could survive it. Mary Ann Thompson went back to teaching at the new elementary school, built on higher ground with reinforced walls and a tornado shelter in the basement. She kept a photograph on her desk of the old school, the one that had been destroyed. She looked at it sometimes and remembered the sound of the roar, the feel of little Jimmy's hand in hers. She remembered the prayer she had whispered. She remembered being afraid, but she also remembered being brave. Gary Thompson started a small construction company. He rebuilt dozens of houses in Bridgeport, including his own. He worked alongside the same neighbors who had once been strangers. They became friends. They became family. He kept the pocket watch in his glove compartment, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been saved. And on the anniversary of the tornado, every year the town gathered in the park. They lit candles, they read the names of the 11 who had died, they shared stories, they held each other, and when the wind picked up, they did not run. They stood still and remembered that they were still here. They were still Bridgeport, and they were strong. They were still Bridgeport, and they were strong. That first anniversary came with a sky of perfect blue, as if the heavens were trying to apologize. The park had been rebuilt, new benches and a new playground, the swings still smelling of fresh paint. 11 dogwood trees had been planted in a circle, one for each life lost. The trees were small then, barely taller than a child, but they were alive. People gathered in that circle at dusk, holding candles in paper cups. The wind was gentle that evening, carrying the scent of cut grass and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Mary Ann Thompson stood with Gary and Jimmy, who was now 6 and had grown 2 inches since the storm. He held his candle carefully, watching the flame dance. When the names were read, Jimmy whispered each one under his breath. He had memorized them from the bronze plaque that now stood at the entrance of the park. Sarah, Louise, Earl's wife, the others. He did not fully understand death, but he understood that these people were gone and that his mother cried when she said their names. Reverend Thomas led a prayer. The crowd bowed their heads, some held hands. When the prayer ended, a man named Curtis, who had lost his wife in the tornado, stepped forward and sang an old gospel hymn without accompaniment. His voice was rough and cracked, but it carried across the park. People joined in, softly at first, then louder. The hymn rose into the evening sky, and for a moment the town felt whole again. After the ceremony, the Thompsons walked home. Their new house stood on the same lot as the old one, but it was different. Gary had designed it himself, with a reinforced safe room in the center, walls thick enough to stop a freight train. The safe room doubled as a pantry. Mary Ann had stocked it with water and batteries and canned food just in case. They did not talk about it, but they both checked the weather forecast obsessively. Every rumble of thunder made them tense. Every alert on their phones made them reach for each other. The fear never fully left. It just went underground like a root that waits for rain. The years passed. Bridgeport grew again slowly like a person learning to walk after a long illness. New families moved in, drawn by the cheap land and the quiet streets. They did not know what had happened here. They did not know that the soil beneath their feet had been soaked with tears. Some of the old-timers resented them at first, these newcomers who had not suffered through that April afternoon. But bitterness is hard to sustain when you are sharing a fence line and a driveway and a neighborly wave. The old-timers began to tell stories. They told the newcomers about the roar, about the sky turning green, about the way the air felt before the tornado hit. They told them about the rescue efforts, about the baby born in the church, about the banner that flew overhead. The newcomers listened. They learned. And slowly the story of the Bridgeport tornado became the story of the town, a story that everyone knew, a story that bound them together. Mary Ann retired from teaching after 30 years. Her last class was a group of fifth graders who had been born after the tornado. She told them about that day, about the sound of the roar, about holding Jimmy's hand in the hallway. She showed them the photograph of the old school, the one that had been flattened. They asked questions. Did you see the tornado? Were you scared? She told them the truth. Yes, I saw it. Yes, I was terrified. But I also saw people help each other. I saw strangers become family. I saw a town refuse to die. That is what I want you to remember, she said, not the destruction. The rebuilding, Gary's construction company thrived. He employed a dozen men, many of them survivors of the tornado. They built houses all over Jackson County, but they took special care with the ones in Bridgeport. They used stronger materials, better anchors, safer designs. Gary insisted on a safe room in every house he built, even if the owners complained about the cost. He told them, you can argue with me, but you can't argue with the wind. Most of them listened, some did not. Gary did not push. He had learned that you cannot force people to be prepared. You can only offer them the chance. The Thompson house became a gathering place for the neighborhood. On summer evenings, Mary Ann would set up chairs on the front porch and people would come by bringing lemonade and stories. Jimmy grew up and went to college in Tuscaloosa, then moved to Birmingham for a job in finance. He visited often, always bringing his girlfriend, a quiet woman named Alina who loved gardening. She helped Mary Ann plant roses along the fence line, the same spot where the original rose bush had grown before the tornado. The new roses took root quickly as if the soil remembered. 10 years after the tornado, the town held a special ceremony. The dogwood trees in the park had grown tall, their branches spreading wide, their blossoms white and pink in the spring. A new memorial had been built, a stone wall with the names of the 11 engraved in bronze letters. The governor came again, a different governor this time, but he said the same words about courage and resilience. The crowd listened politely, but they were not there for him. They were there for each other. Mary Ann spoke at the ceremony. She stood at the podium, her hair gray now, her hands steady. She looked out at the faces in the crowd. Some were old, lined with the memory of that day. Some were young, curious, born into a world that had already been reshaped. She told the story again, the story of the roar and the prayer and the hand she held. She told them about the baby named Grace, who was now 10 years old and sitting in the front row with her mother. She told them about the janitor Earl, who still worked at the new school, who still swept the hallways every afternoon, who still talked about his wife as if she had just stepped out for a moment. She told them about the farmer Luther, who had looked into the camera and said, "We ain't dead yet." Luther had passed away 2 years ago, but his words lived on. They had become the town's motto. When Mary Ann finished, the crowd applauded. Then they lit candles and held them up, 1,000 small flames against the twilight. The wind picked up, a soft breeze that rustled the dogwood leaves. No one flinched. They had learned to read the wind, to know the difference between a storm and a whisper. This was a whisper. After the ceremony, Gary took Mary Ann's hand and they walked to the spot where their old house had stood. The new house was behind them, warm lights glowing in the windows. The foundation slab had been covered with grass, but Gary knew exactly where the living room had been. He stopped and closed his eyes. Mary Ann leaned against him. They did not speak. They did not need to. They had said everything there was to say, over and over, for 10 years. They had rebuilt their home, their marriage, their town. They had held each other through the nightmares and the anniversaries and the ordinary days. They stood there for a long time until the candles in the park burned low and the crowd dispersed. Then they walked back to the house hand in hand and sat on the porch swing. The sky was clear, full of stars. The air was still. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car drove past, its headlights sweeping across the yard. Mary Ann rested her head on Gary's shoulder and they watched the night settle around them like a blanket. The Bridgeport tornado had taken lives. It had taken homes. It had taken the sense of safety that people carry like a second skin. But it had not taken their ability to love. It had not taken their capacity for joy. They had learned, as survivors always do, that grief and gratitude can exist in the same heart. They had learned that a town is not just a place. It is a story told over and over, passed from hand to hand, from generation to generation. And that story, like the dogwood trees in the park, would keep growing. In the years that followed, the town continued to change. The old diner was torn down and replaced with a coffee shop run by a young couple from Nashville. The Baptist church got a new steeple, straight and tall, painted white. The high school football team won the state championship, and the victory parade wound through the streets, past the park, past the memorial, past the houses that had been rebuilt and painted and lived in. The players wore jerseys with the number 11 on the sleeve in honor of those who had died. No one had to explain why. Everyone knew. Jimmy Thompson married Alina in that same park, under the dogwood trees, on a warm Saturday in June. Mary Ann cried, Gary beamed. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, the same hall that had been used as a shelter on that terrible night. Alina's mother, who had come from Mexico for the wedding, asked about the photograph on the wall. It showed a pile of debris with a single American flag standing upright in the middle. Mary Ann told her the story. Alina's mother listened, then crossed herself and said a prayer in Spanish. Through her translator, she said, "This is a place that knows what matters." And so the story continued. New children were born, new families arrived, new memories were made. The tornado became a footnote in the town's history, a reference point for weather events and insurance policies and local lore. But for those who had lived through it, it remained as sharp as broken glass. They carried it with them always, in the way they checked the sky, in the way they held their children close during storms, in the way they greeted each other with a warmth that only comes from shared hardship. Mary Ann Thompson died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78. Gary found her in the morning, her hand resting on the photograph of the old school. He sat beside her for a long time, holding her hand, remembering the hallway, the roar, the prayer. He did not cry. He was too old for tears, or perhaps he had already cried enough. He called Jimmy, who came from Birmingham with Alina and their 2 children. The grandchildren had never known their grandmother's town before the tornado, but they had heard the stories. They walked through the park, touching the dogwood trees, reading the names on the memorial. The youngest, a boy named Samuel, asked his father why the trees were planted in a circle. Jimmy knelt down and said, "Because that way nobody stands alone. They are all holding hands." At the funeral, the church was full. People came from across the county, some who had never met Mary Ann but knew her story. The pastor delivered a eulogy about courage and kindness and the power of a single prayer whispered in the dark. The choir sang the same hymn that Curtis had sung at the first anniversary. Gary sat in the front row, holding Jimmy's hand. He thought about the pocket watch, still in his glove compartment, still wrapped in the old cloth. He thought about the concrete slab where their house had stood. He thought about Mary Ann's hand in his that afternoon on the curb when they had nothing left but each other. He stood up and walked to the podium. He cleared his throat. He said, "Mary Ann taught me that you don't have to be strong alone, you just have to be strong together." That's what she did. She held my hand and she held this town's hand and she never let go. I hope I can do the same. He stepped down and returned to his seat. The congregation was silent. Then one by one people began to stand. They stood in silence, holding hands with the person next to them. The chain stretched across the pews, across the aisle, out the door and into the parking lot. No one spoke. The wind blew through the open windows, rustling the program notes. It was a gentle wind, a summer breeze, but everyone felt it, everyone remembered. And the story of the Bridgeport tornado lived on, not as a tragedy, but as a testament. A testament to the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. A testament to the stubborn, unyielding belief that even after the worst has happened, there is still a reason to wake up in the morning, still a reason to plant a tree, still a reason to hold someone's hand. The town continued to grow. The population ticked upward. The school added a new wing. The coffee shop expanded its menu. But the dogwood trees in the park never stopped blooming. Every spring, their white and pink petals drifted across the grass like confetti, and children gathered them up to press in books. And every year on the anniversary, the candles came out again and the names were read again and the wind was watched again, not with fear, with respect. Because the people of Bridgeport knew something that the rest of the world sometimes forgot. They knew that the wind could take everything away in an instant. But they also knew that what remained, the love, the memory, the community, was stronger than any storm. It was invisible, but it was unbreakable. It was the thing that held them together even when the ground beneath them had been swept clean. And so the seasons turned, spring to summer, summer to fall, fall to winter, winter to spring. The dogwood trees grew taller, the children grew older, the survivors grew wise, and the town kept telling its story, passing it down, weaving it into the fabric of everyday life. It was a story about a tornado, yes. But it was also a story about a teacher who prayed with her students, a janitor who went back to sweeping, a diner owner who fed people from a broken window, a retired nurse who delivered a baby on a pile of donated blankets, a farmer who looked into a camera and refused to give up. It was a story about a town that was hit by a train and got back up, and it was still standing. The old diner's replacement, the coffee shop run by the young couple from Nashville, became a gathering place for story swapping. Its walls were lined with photographs of the aftermath donated by families who wanted the memories to stay visible. The couple, whose names were Will and Sarah, had never experienced a tornado themselves. They had moved to Bridgeport because of the cheap rent and the quiet streets. But they quickly learned that quiet did not mean empty. Every customer who walked through the door carried fragments of the storm. Will learned to listen. Sarah learned to ask. They brewed coffee and they brewed stories, and the shop became a living archive. One afternoon, an elderly man named Henry came in for his usual black coffee and a biscuit. He was a retired mail carrier, and he had been delivering letters on the day of the tornado. He told Will about how he had taken shelter in a ditch behind the post office, clutching a bag of undelivered mail. When the wind stopped, he crawled out and began walking the streets, handing out envelopes to people who had no homes anymore. He delivered a birthday card to a child whose house was gone. The child opened it right there in the street, and inside was a $5 bill from a grandmother in Ohio. The child's mother cried. Henry cried. He said that was the day he understood what the mail really carried. It was not just letters, it was connection. Will hung that story on the wall too, written on a piece of cardboard above the biscuit warmer. Customers read it while they waited for their orders. Some smiled, some wiped their eyes. Some took pictures and posted them online, and the story of Henry the mail carrier spread beyond Bridgeport. A news station from Birmingham came to interview him. He sat in the coffee shop, wearing his old postal uniform, and told the story again. After that, people started sending letters to Bridgeport from all over the country. Letters of support, letters of gratitude, letters from other tornado survivors who recognized themselves in Henry's words. The town held a letter reading event in the park. Volunteers stood at a microphone and read the messages aloud. Some were addressed to specific families, some were addressed to the town itself. One letter came from a fourth-grade class in Michigan. The students had drawn pictures of houses with strong roofs and big trees and blue skies. They wrote, "We hope you're safe. We hope you have enough ice cream." The town laughed and cried at the same time. The letter was laminated and placed in the memorial case beside the photograph of the flag in the debris. Jimmy Thompson's son Samuel grew up surrounded by these stories. He was the youngest grandchild, the one who had asked why the trees were planted in a circle. By the time he was 12, he knew the names of everyone on the memorial by heart. He could point to each dogwood tree and tell you who it was planted for. His friends thought it was odd, but they also respected it. Samuel had a quiet seriousness about him, a gravity that seemed older than his years. He often walked to the park after school and sat on the bench near the center of the circle. He would close his eyes and listen to the wind. He was not afraid, he was remembering. His father Jimmy noticed this and worried sometimes. But his mother Alina said, "He is carrying the story. That is not a burden, that is a gift." When Samuel was 16, a minor tornado touched down on the outskirts of Bridgeport. It was a weak storm, barely an EF0, but it knocked down a few trees and tore the roof off a barn. The sirens went off, people took shelter. Samuel was at school and he watched his classmates panic. Some were crying, some were calling their parents, but Samuel stood by the window watching the sky. A teacher told him to get away from the glass. He obeyed, but he said, "It's not going to hit us." The teacher asked how he knew. He said, "Because we already paid our dues." The tornado passed without causing significant damage, but the event triggered something in the town. People who had not talked about the tornado in years started sharing their memories again. The coffee shop held a community storytelling night, and more than 100 people showed up. They stood at the microphone and told their stories. Some had never spoken publicly before. An old woman named Ruth, who had lived alone on the edge of town, described how she had hidden in her bathtub with a mattress over her head. She said she had prayed to a god she was not sure she believed in, and when the storm passed, she found a photograph of her late husband lying in the yard, somehow unbroken, the glass still intact. She had kept it on her nightstand ever since. She said, "That picture is why I still believe something watches over us." Ruth passed away that winter, and her photograph was donated to the memorial case. It now sits next to the letter from the fourth graders. The glass is still intact. Gary lived to be 92. He spent his final years sitting on the porch swing, watching the stars, talking to anyone who would listen. He became the town's unofficial historian. Schoolchildren came to interview him for projects. He told them about the hallway, about Mary Ann's prayer, about the janitor who swept up the glass. He always ended the same way: "The wind can take your house, but it cannot take your story. You are the only one who can give that away." He died on the anniversary of the tornado, though no one noticed until the next morning. He had simply fallen asleep on the porch swing and not woken up. The paramedics said it was peaceful. The neighbors said it was fitting. The funeral was held in the park, right in the circle of dogwood trees. The trees were in full bloom, petals drifted across the casket like snow. Jimmy gave the eulogy and he used his father's own words. He said, "Gary taught us that the wind cannot take your story, so let us keep telling it," and they did. The town faced other trials over the decades. A factory closed. A flood damaged the low-lying neighborhoods. A pandemic swept through and shut down the schools. But each time, the community rallied. They had learned how to survive together. They had learned how to ask for help. They had learned how to hold hands. The coffee shop changed hands when Will and Sarah retired, but the new owner kept the story wall. She added more photographs, more letters, more memories. The memorial in the park was renovated with a stone bench and a plaque that read, "In remembrance of those we lost. In celebration of those we saved, in gratitude for those who helped." The high school football team still wore the number 11 on their sleeves. The tradition had become a point of pride not just for the players but for the whole town. When a player graduated, he passed the jersey to a younger teammate. The number never retired. It kept moving season after season, a symbol of continuity. Samuel Thompson became a meteorologist. He moved away to study, but he came back to Bridgeport to work at the local weather station. He was the one who issued the warnings now. He stood in the studio and looked at the radar screens, and he thought about his grandparents, about the hallway, about the prayer. He never let a storm go by without speaking to the camera with a calm, steady voice. He knew that people were listening in their bathtubs, in their closets, in their hallways. He knew that some of them were praying. He always ended his broadcast with the same line, "Stay safe, stay together, you are not alone." One night, a severe thunderstorm warning was issued for the county. It was not a tornado, but it was powerful winds and large hail. Samuel stayed on air for hours, tracking the storm, giving updates. As the storm passed, he saw a strange signature on the radar, a small rotation. It lasted only a few seconds, then dissipated. He held his breath. It was nothing. But he thought about his father, about the pocket watch, about the concrete slab. He thought about Mary Ann's voice whispering in the darkness. He took a sip of water and continued the broadcast. After the storm, he drove out to the park. The streets were wet, reflecting the streetlights. The dogwood trees were bare, it being winter, but their branches reached toward the sky like fingers. He stood in the circle in the center and looked up. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing patches of stars. He remembered his grandmother's hand, the prayer, the roan sound that was not a train. He remembered his grandfather's pocket watch, still in the glove compartment of his car. He had never opened it. He was not sure he ever would, but he felt their presence as real as the cold air on his face. He felt the weight of the story, the thousand stories, all woven together into a single thread that connected him to every person who had ever stood in that circle. He whispered, "Thank you," and the wind for just a moment seemed to answer. It rustled the bare branches. It carried the sound of a distant dog barking. It was gentle, like a hand on his shoulder. Samuel walked back to his car. He drove home to his wife and his young daughter, who was sleeping with a stuffed dogwood flower that her grandmother had made. He kissed her forehead and climbed into bed. As he drifted off, he thought about the next day. He would go to the coffee shop. He would order a black coffee and a biscuit. He would look at the story wall. He would see the picture of the flag in the debris. He would remember. And so the story continued, not with a bang, not with a dramatic finale, but with the quiet, persistent rhythm of everyday life. The dogwood trees kept blooming. The candles kept being lit. The names kept being read. The wind kept blowing and the people kept holding hands. And the town, that small town in Alabama, that place that had been hit by a tornado and refused to stay down, kept telling its story to anyone who would listen. It was a story about loss and love. It was a story about fear and faith. It was a story about a teacher who prayed and a janitor who swept and a farmer who was not afraid to cry. It was a story about a people who understood that the worst day of their lives had not been the end of their story. It was only the beginning of a new one. And that new one was still being written, one season at a time, one handhold at a time, one prayer at a time. The night was quiet, the stars were bright. Somewhere a dog barked, a car drove past, its headlights sweeping across the yard, and in 100 homes, in 100 hearts, the memory of the Bridgeport tornado lived on, not as a wound, as a touchstone, a reminder that even in the darkest moment we can find each other. And that is enough, that is everything. The seasons turned. Spring came again, and the dogwood trees in the park burst into a profusion of white and pink blossoms. The annual memorial ceremony, now in its 32nd year, drew a crowd that spilled out onto the grass. Families brought blankets and lawn chairs. Children ran between the trees, their laughter mixing with the solemn notes of a bagpiper playing Amazing Grace. The fire department raised the American flag, the same one that had been found in the debris, now carefully preserved in a climate-controlled case at the town hall. The flag was too fragile to fly anymore, but every year they brought it out, unfolded it with white-gloved hands, and held it aloft for a moment of silence. Jimmy, now in his late 60s, stepped up to the microphone. His hair was gray, his back bent, but his voice still carried the weight of that day. He read the names of the 23 people who had died. He paused after each name, letting the silence settle. The crowd whispered the names back, a chorus of memory. Then he read the names of the babies born in the aftermath, the children who had arrived in the months after the storm, as if the town had needed new life to balance the loss. There were 37 of them now, and they stood in a group near the front. A few had moved away, but most had stayed. They were the tornado generation, the ones who had grown up with the story woven into their bones. One of them, a young woman named Maya, approached the microphone after Jimmy finished. She was the granddaughter of Mary Ann Thompson, the teacher who had prayed in the hallway. Maya had become a teacher herself at the same elementary school where her grandmother had taught. She stood before the crowd, her voice steady. She said that every year on the anniversary, she read her grandmother's letter to her students. She told them about the hallway, about the prayer, about the janitor who had swept up the glass. She told them that fear was not a weakness, that it was a door you had to walk through. She said that her grandmother had taught her that the bravest thing a person could do was to ask for help, to reach out, to hold a hand. The crowd nodded. A few wiped their eyes. After the ceremony, the community gathered in the high school gymnasium for a potluck dinner. The tables were covered with checkered cloths and laden with casseroles, fried chicken, collard greens, and banana pudding. The coffee was strong and the conversation was loud. People moved from table to table, hugging, laughing, telling stories. A group of teenagers sat in a corner, looking at old photographs on a tablet. They had been assigned a history project about the tornado and they were interviewing survivors. The oldest survivor present was a man named Earl who had been a young firefighter on that day. He was now 95, frail but sharp. He told the teenagers about pulling bodies from the rubble, about the sound of a man calling for his wife, about the moment he found a baby alive under an overturned sofa. He said that he still had nightmares but that he had learned to talk about them. He said that the talking was what made them less heavy. One of the teenagers asked him if he was afraid of storms. Earl laughed, a dry, crackling sound. He said, "I've been afraid of storms my whole life, but I've also learned that fear can be a compass. It tells you what matters, and what matters is the people next to you." The teenagers wrote down every word. They would later turn their project into a short film, which would be shown at the local cinema and then uploaded to YouTube. It would get a few thousand views, mostly from relatives and former residents. But it would also be watched by a meteorology class in Oklahoma and by a disaster relief organization in Texas and by a group of students in Japan who were studying community resilience. The film would be translated into 5 languages. It would win an award at a small film festival, and it would be remembered not for its production value but for its honesty. Samuel Thompson's daughter, Lily, was one of those teenagers. She had grown up hearing the story from her father, but she had never fully understood it until she interviewed Earl. She sat in the gymnasium that evening, writing in her notebook, and she looked over at her father, who was talking to the new coffee shop owner. Samuel caught her eye and smiled. He raised his coffee cup in a toast. Lily raised her notebook. It was their private signal. The years passed. The town grew and changed. A new housing development went up on the east side, where the old wrecking yard had been. A chain coffee shop opened near the highway, but it never did as well as the local one. The story wall expanded to include a digital component, a touchscreen kiosk where visitors could record their own memories. The kiosk was installed in the park under a small gazebo. It had a microphone and a camera, and it asked one simple question: "What does Bridgeport mean to you?" The answers ranged from funny to heartbreaking. A little boy said it meant where my grandma lives. A woman in her 80s said it meant the place where I learned to forgive. A man who had moved away years ago said it meant the only place in the world where I ever felt truly seen. One afternoon, a young couple moved into the house that had once belonged to Gary. They had bought it at auction, unaware of its history. They were from out-of-state professionals who had taken jobs in the nearby city. They painted the walls, replaced the roof, and installed new windows. They found the concrete slab in the backyard and considered removing it, but something stopped them. The husband said, "It kind of feels like an anchor." The wife agreed. They planted a dogwood tree next to it. It grew quickly, as if the soil remembered. That winter, a tornado warning was issued for the county. It was the first significant threat in nearly a decade. Samuel went on air, his voice calm and measured. He told people to take shelter, to stay low, to stay together. He told them that they had survived before and they would survive again. The storm passed just north of town, leaving a path of downed trees and damaged roofs but no injuries. Samuel breathed a sigh of relief and signed off. He sat in the studio for a long moment, looking at the dark screen. He thought about his grandmother, about the hallway, about the prayer. He thought about his daughter, who was now in college studying meteorology. He thought about the cycle, the way the story kept turning, the way the wind kept blowing, the way the people kept holding on. He drove home through the rain. The streets were slick, reflecting the red taillights of cars ahead. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the car for a moment, listening to the rain on the roof. He opened the glove compartment and took out the pocket watch. It was heavy, cold. He had never felt ready to open it. But tonight something shifted. He held it in his palm and turned it over. The silver casing was tarnished, the engraving nearly worn smooth. He pressed the catch. The lid popped open with a soft click. The face was cracked, the hands frozen at 4:23. He stared at them for a long time. That was the moment he realized. That was the exact time the tornado had hit. His grandfather had captured it, captured the instant, and then the watch had stopped. But the story had not stopped. It had kept going through the debris, through the grief, through the rebuilding, through the laughter in the coffee shop, through the petals drifting across a casket, through the voices of 100 speakers at 100 microphones. He closed the watch and put it back in the glove compartment. He walked inside. The house was quiet. His wife had left a note on the counter, dinner in the fridge, call me when you get home, love you. He smiled. He ate a cold piece of chicken and a spoonful of coleslaw, standing in the kitchen looking out the window at the rain. It was a soft rain now, steady and gentle, washing the streets clean. He thought about the next morning. He would go to the coffee shop. He would order a black coffee and a biscuit. He would look at the story wall. He would see the picture of the flag, the letter from the fourth graders, the photograph of Ruth's husband. He would remember, and then he would go to the park. He would stand in the circle of dogwood trees under the gray sky and he would whisper the names. He would whisper his grandmother's name. He would whisper his grandfather's name. He would whisper the names of the 23, the ones he had never met but had come to know through the stories. And he would thank them. He would thank them for teaching him that the wind could take many things, but it could never take the story. The story was in the soil, in the roots, in the voices of the children. The story was in the air itself, carried on the breeze, waiting to be told again, and again, and again. The rain stopped, the clouds parted, a sliver of moonlight fell across the park. The dogwood trees stood silent, their branches shining with water. And in the quiet, in the dark, the town of Bridgeport slept, wrapped in the memory of a day that had changed everything and in the promise of all the days still to come. Because the story never really ends. It just keeps unfolding, one handhold at a time, one prayer at a time, one breath at a time, and that is everything. And it is also only the beginning.